The Institute of Internal Auditors presents All Things Internal Audit Tech. In this episode, Warren Stippich speaks with Ethan Rojhani about the evolving role of agentic artificial intelligence in internal auditing. They discuss how agentic AI differs from traditional AI, its impact on risk assessment, and the skills internal auditors will need to adapt. They talk about the ethical considerations, automation of controls testing, and the future of AI-driven audit execution.
Hey, so let's dive in here, Ethan. Glad to see you today, and we'll have some fun with this conversation. So, out of the gate, like to have a little discussion with you, Ethan, and some perspective. Can you give an explanation of what agentic AI is and how it differs from traditional AI systems?
It's a great question, Warren. It's a big topic in industry right now. And in short, agentic AI is kind of what we've all been thinking AI would be, for many, many years. It's that proactive artificial intelligence that has that ability to act. Let me give you my favorite analogy, and then I'll go through some of the differences. My favorite analogy is traditional AI is like a good librarian. You ask a question, and it goes and it finds you the answer. Agentic AI is more like an investigative journalist where it goes and seeks out information, it finds leads, it makes decisions, and it comes back and it gives you that information that you could basically say, "Hey, go tell me what's going on with Grant Thornton these days," and it'll come and it'll write a full article for you based on that, rather than just kind of giving you an answer, and it'll make some decisions on your behalf as well. I think that's really something that differentiates it. But in looking at the differences between traditional AI and agentic AI, there's several categories of differentiation. One of them is reactivity. Traditional AI tools like ChatGPT or Claude, which is a tool that you can get on Amazon, which is part of Anthropic's system. They're very reactive, right? You ask a question, it comes back with an answer, and it could be a very good answer, or it might not be totally correct. It'll be like a human; it'll make mistakes, but it's not very proactive. Versus agentic AIs, on the other hand, they're very proactive, right? It might wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, Ethan, I know that you were looking at, what's going on with Grant Thornton yesterday. I just want you to know there's a news update that I think you would find very interesting. Can I give that to you today because I know that that's something you were thinking about?" Or, "Hey, Warren, I know that you're really interested, in audit quality. I see that there's a new update for the Audit Standards Board, or the IA has updated its policies. Can we do a quick summary of those?" So agentic AI is very proactive, just like a human being might be. And the other one is autonomy. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, right? So, again, traditional AIs like ChatGPT, they're really limited to the questions that you pose to it versus some of the new agentic AIs that are coming out. They have the ability to make decisions and actions on their own. It really gets a little bit scary. And so we talk about the risks associated with that because there should always be a human in the loop at this point. But, we're starting to see AIs checking AIs. For example, we call those multi-agent systems. One of the areas where I think that there's a big difference, which really kind of gets me excited and interesting, is that there's a goal orientation for agentic AIs. And this is something that I find to be super interesting. You can almost give the AI its own persona and say, your goal is to be the best senior associate in internal audit possible. And you're going to review the work of some of the associates, and we want you to understand how to lead walkthroughs, how to create flowcharts, how to do assessments. And that AI is never going to give up that goal. It's going to be something that it continually works towards improving on its own. Versus a traditional AI, it doesn't have goals. It's just it's task oriented. It executes on tasks, but it doesn't really have a goal of where can I take things in the future. They're both learning and adaptive, right? That's something that doesn't change. They both have reasoning, right? They've built in some of the reasoning responses, but again, going back to that discussion around goal orientation and proactivity, is that the agentic AIs have the ability to plan sequences of actions to achieve a goal. On a short level, going back to the analogy that I used about a journalist, its goal is to go out and collect information about complex topics and then to synthesize those into a report. Versus AI is just going to give you a dump of information based on what it was able to uncover. I think the last area that I'll share that I think is a big difference, which I find to be very interesting, is interaction with the environment. Right now, the traditional AIs and large language models like GPT or Claude, they really do process static inputs. So it's a give and react system. I give them a question, it reacts back. I give it an idea, it reacts back. The new agentic AIs can actually engage with external systems and modify their approach and their behaviors dynamically. And we're starting to see that in some of the autonomous vehicles that are out there, where it can learn from experiences that it has driving on a road, and it will modify that going forward. So you're starting to see that, kind of implementing in the real world with systems that have, it can take multiple inputs, so visual inputs as well as written inputs. Large language models tend to be just, for the most part, written with some pictures. Versus now you're starting to see videos. You're starting to see understanding of the weather for some of the new systems that are being, developed for, call it, flight and aerospace systems. So, those agents can actually interact with the environment. So that was a very long-winded answer for you there, Warren, and sorry for that. It's something I'm very passionate about. So, wanted to make sure that we definitely talk through some of the differences.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you setting the stage on essentially this definitional explanation on these two and my question. What I'd like you to do now is take your crystal ball out and take the cover off of it, set it on the table. I know our listeners love data driven answers and data driven perspectives, and so I'd like to bring in the Internal Audit Foundation's Vision 2035 research and report that was put out last year. If our listeners don't have it, go to the Internal Audit Foundation's webpage and download a free copy. It has a lot of good information as we look to 2035, right? We look at the profession and what are things that we're going to need as we go forward. So for you, Ethan, and kind of the crystal ball point of view, in our analysis, in our research, in our data, we had a series of questions around technologies and emerging technologies. One in particular relevant to this topic around AI is that 48% of our responders in the research are involved in AI activities, and it's varying degrees of activities, but in some way, shape, or form, involved in active in looking at artificial intelligence. Now, 48% is probably low, which is a startling revelation, but maybe, and some would say it's not that low, given where we are at the time the research was done in 2024 and as we move into 2025. Okay, so here's the crystal ball question for you. How do you see agentic AI transforming internal audit functions in the next 5 to 10 years as we look towards 2035?
Okay. Well, probably there's a lot of ways it's going to transform. Warren, we've as you know, we've been working with a lot of the large tech companies, and so we're getting an early preview of what's going to be coming down the pike. And I'm happy to share those examples. I would totally encourage you to pause me as we go through these examples, because
Okay.
some of these use cases are just mind blowing. I would imagine that 48% that's using AI, it's probably some of the traditional LLMs, ChatGPT among them. Such great tools, right? They help you think through critical examples. They help you learn, right? It's like having a buddy there next to you. That's great, right? But what we're seeing coming down the pike is just astounding. So I'll start with my favorite one. At the beginning of the year, we do a risk assessment, right? Enterprise risk assessment, internal audit risk assessment, financial controls risk assessment, whatever risk assessment you're doing, you do that at the beginning of the year for internal audit. And it's usually a periodic type activity, maybe a survey, maybe a conversation, an interview. Maybe it's we're looking at policies and data and we're consolidating that into some risk assessment to drive whatever. Sometimes, for internal audit, it's often what audits are we going to do throughout the year, and how are we aligning the risk with the audit and making sure that we're addressing that appropriately and getting feedback from management. Agentic AI may flip this model on its head, for the simple reason that rather than having to do a periodic audit, imagine having an AI that could sit there and monitor communications, have conversations with the executive team, have conversations with the people in the field, consolidate that information. We all interact with these AIs on a consistent basis, and it knows what the concerns are. It can read the emails that are coming in and going out. It can look at the transaction information that's going. It's really moving to that continuous real-time monitoring that we've been talking about for many years. But because it's so easy for these AIs now to take a look at this unstructured information as it's flowing around organizations, it can now begin to get a sense of what are some of these real risks, right? It can autonomously adjust risk scores. We can give it a risk model and say, hey, here's what our model is. And it can say, you know what, based on what I'm seeing coming out of our operations, we need to adjust that. Additionally, it can, monitor for global threats, emerging anomalies, macroeconomic conditions. I mean, it can incorporate a spectrum of data that we haven't been able to fathom for many years into that risk assessment and really help us hone in on what is a big issue. And as we've started to see this happen, it's actually uncovered things that, the humans might have missed. On the flip side of that, it sometimes gives us information that it thinks is a big issue because people are working very hard on it, but it's really not that big an issue. So a good example is, some of the early AIs in the agentic world that we've seen, they tend to take an outsized focus on some of the compliance related activities that are critical, right? But we need to go do SOX work. We need to make sure that those financial controls are in place. However, from a perspective from an executive, as long as there's no material weaknesses, there's no significant deficiencies, those are just normal course of business things that need to be addressed, and the real risks need to be more operationally focused. And I know that that's something that the IA is kind of moving toward, is how do we help internal audit be more of the consultative partner that helps address some of the organizational risks, and try to make sure that we're spending the right amount of time on our compliance. So let me pause there. That was one example. I think I've got like 4 or 5 more if you want to run through them.
Yeah.
Why don't I start with the one that's in use right now? It's automated control testing and exception handling. We have a tool called Comply AI. It's going to be in its second revision. And instead of auditing samples of vendor payments, we're able to ingest that data, and we're able to optimize our control testing procedures right away. The future of that is going to be testing of 100% of transactions. We're targeting the end of the summer for automatically ingesting information and applying those control tests on a continuous basis. The firm, Grant Thornton, along with some of our tech partners and banking partners, we released a report last summer that was, how to take advantage of 100% control testing, and how to think about exceptions and issues and detecting anomalies. So I'm certainly happy to go further into that. But I think that's one of the key use cases that we're seeing right now, and folks love it because it minimizes that compliance burden and enables folks to focus more on business operations and operational audits. I think the other area that we're forecasting in our world is looking at intelligent anomaly detection, and that predictive risk forecasting. We've been talking about this for so many years, and there's some very niche tools that can do it in the IT space. Think about CrowdStrike, for example. There's some smaller tools that can do it in like the accounts payable space. If you think about some of the AP tools that are out there for managing that, but there's nothing that kind of thinks about it globally or holistically. And so over time, we're going to see some of that predictive risk forecasting happen with some of these agentic AI tools. A great example, you might see minor expense reimbursements. I remember we discovered this with a client, a governmental client a few years ago, where there were $4 charges, or you just, charges right around $4. And I remember we did a forensic analysis of that, and we uncovered that those charges were all named after the Grateful Dead. And we're like, well, that's really odd. It turned out it was a massive scale fraud that was being done in a micro level, right? AI could do that in real time rather than having to do a whole forensic assessment, costs thousands of dollars and takes hours and hours of time to do that. AIs can detect that as they're moving through, right? Hey, why is one of the Grateful Dead doing $4 transactions every Tuesday, right? It's something that they would pick up on that a human might not. Maybe I would say the other one that I think would be very, very interesting. We were talking earlier about some of the concerns for humans' jobs being replaced. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's just going to elevate the role that we do. But I can see it at the point where we have AI-driven audit execution and reporting, right? So where the agentic AIs can actually autonomously perform certain audit steps for us, like data extraction, issue follow-up, right? There's no longer a need to send an email to our folks in inventory, for example, because the agentic AI realizes that there's something missing, and it just sends an email and says, hey, we noticed that you were missing this large item in inventory. What happened with that? Right. So, it's kind of moving away from that one-time periodic audit to just kind of keeping an eye on things throughout the year, and restructuring that audit as something that's happening throughout the year that the agentic AI is keeping tabs on and giving us a report and letting us know if it's seeing something that's consistent or an issue. So I think that's kind of, where I would say is kind of the next frontier. That's really like what I would say is 5 to 10 years out, where you have these AIs actually performing these audits on a continuous basis, with input from the humans and coming back and reporting on things, moving away from that periodic that periodic audit type idea.
What I'd like to do now is move on in that, looking at the talent component, and really in our Vision 2035 analysis, we did a lot of research around what the profession's going to need in terms of technical capabilities and what will the internal auditor's background of the future hold. Probably different than what the internal auditor of the past has had in his or her college education and toolkit of experience. So, with that stage set and thinking about the talent preparation of future internal auditors, what do you think those that are working in the world of agentic AI are going to need to have in terms of skills and capabilities?
So that's a great question, right? It's kind of fun. I see this changing dramatically with our staff, and with students that are coming out of college. I think as you think about how it's going to become core to our operations as an organization, as it will for everybody, some of the key competencies that we're going to be needing to think about, I call it AI literacy. We used to call it data analytics, Warren, which I know that you're very familiar with. But in this case, it's, rather than having to actually write the structured SQL and to build the visualizations ourselves, it's going to be how do you interact with an AI to actually generate the information that you need to understand that, right? So if I were to say that there's 3 or 4 core competencies that you really need to think about, one is AI fundamentals, which is what model are you working with? Are you working with a machine learning model? Are you working with an agentic AI? Are you working with something that generates analytics? So it's really just understanding the model itself. Do you have to be a coder? No, absolutely not. You just have to understand how they operate so that you know in what capacity do you actually use the right AI. It's the right tool for the right job situation, right? You don't bring a hammer when you need a screwdriver. At the same time, you don't use a machine learning tool when what you really need to do is have something that proactively generates your risk assessments, which would be an agentic AI.
Where do you think we'll go for talent? Where do you think the professional have to recruit?
I think that it's going to come from within, to be honest. I think it's going to be a learning exercise. The metaphor or the analogy that I always use is think about the conversion from basic ledgers, handwritten ledgers, to spreadsheets. There were some folks that just never got on board with how to use a personal laptop and a spreadsheet. There will probably be some folks that just never get on board with how to work with the AIs. However, the vast majority of folks that were bookkeepers when spreadsheets came online learned. They're like, hey, I need to know how to learn how to use this spreadsheet. It's going to be the future of our industry from an accounting perspective. And they went and they learned it. So I think it's going to be a training exercise. It's going to be a generational shift in many ways. So colleges for sure are going to do the training, but I think other organizations like the IIA are going to be very, very fundamental to training folks how to use it.
Yeah, that's a great layout of how you're thinking about it, and I know many of our fellow internal auditors and chief audit executives are having these dialogue conversations right now as we go through this. So, a very relevant response. As we continue down the path of being very, very compliant oriented and strategic advisors and finding the balance there, right? In our Vision 2035 analysis and report, we did a lot of research around where we're at today on assurance or compliance work and where advisory sits in today's plan, if you will, and where do we need to go? What would be the ideal future? And so today, we're at 676% doing assurance or compliance work and 24% doing advisory work. The ideal future, based on our research, the respondents felt that assurance would come down to 59%, so kind of the compliance work would fall, and advisory needs to increase to 41% or more. So that sets the stage for this question as we look at the importance and really the request of stakeholders, management teams, and even our own internal audit leaders for internal auditors to become strategic advisors in the future. How can agentic AI help auditors transition from compliance focused roles to more proactive advisory type positions?
Ooh, that's a good one. So a few ways, right? So obviously we talked about some of the automation of risk assessments, right? One of the other areas that there's a thousand use cases, right? And we're seeing this happen more and more consistently. So a lot of our major clients are looking at how to automate controls testing because it's a compliance exercise. A lot of it is rote in terms of it's very consistent year to year. It does require some logic and some reasoning, but some of our tools like Comply AI can automate a lot of that right now. And there's other tools that are out there like N8N that can automate a lot of that work and start to bring that workload down and help managers, especially IA managers, reorient their staff towards more business focused functions. So that's really, the big help is taking that workload down in the areas that they don't want. And there's been a very unusual side effect of that. As we bring more AI to the table, one of the things that we've discovered is that it actually increases the satisfaction of employees with their jobs. They're happier to be doing the work that they're actually doing because they can use the AI tools to automate a large portion of the things that they don't like. I mean, I don't know about you, Warren, but how many of us actually really enjoyed formatting our documents for grammar and consistency? It was one of those things that, as a former engineer myself, I really hated that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, now the AI can do that for me and it does it in seconds. And so, that half hour of my day is now, freed up for those things that I'm really interested in, which is going out and taking a look at what real risks are to the organization.
So freeing up the time of the assurance and compliance work by some of these tools is great. What's an example of where you think that agentic AI could plug into the strategic side of what we do?
Ooh, that's a great one. How about I give you a good example of one that I actually, know about, Warren. So in this case, one of the big challenges for one of our retail clients was demand fluctuations. Right? They didn't understand, where is the demand coming from. They're having a hard time forecasting, and they weren't sure exactly like how to correct for that issue. Right? They need to be able to forecast budgets, but demand was kind of all over the place. And so, internal audit stepped in and said, why don't we do an audit of the demand forecasting and we'll apply AI and see what happens. And what they discovered was that the AI tools were really good at not just helping with the compliance monitoring aspect, but with also, helping to predict some of that customer demand fluctuation. Where was that inventory going to be needed? When was it going to be needed? And it was an interesting side effect. And it was really one of those things where they're like, wow, internal audit just solved our biggest problem, which was how do we actually help with demand forecasting? And it was a side effect of them coming in and doing an audit of something that had been a challenge for them many times. And that's one of those areas where by being skilled in this space, that retail client was able to say internal audit is truly a business partner because they brought AI to a consistent problem that we've had for a long time.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I hope our listeners can reflect on that a little bit and apply it and broaden it to other areas that might be relevant in their shops. I want to talk a bit about kind of the ethical and risk consideration aspect of this. So a little different perspective, a little different conversation, but auditors nonetheless, right? We're using these tools and we will use these tools, but how can auditors ensure that accountability and transparency and reliability is in place? Not necessarily, we're not lawyers, so I know we can qualify that and say, now we're not going to get a legal response to this question, but let's get a practical answer for internal auditors. So, Ethan, what do you think?
That's a great one. People always jump. There's three key risks that I'll talk about here. One of them is the one that everybody always thinks about, which is AI bias and data integrity. Right? AI learns from historical data. You can contaminate it. There can be biases in the data. There can be biases in the model. If it's trained on flawed data, it can misinterpret risks or misprioritize controls. The way that you mitigate that really that bias is just regularly going back and checking the data that you have underlying for accuracy, fairness. Making sure you're removing it. And really the biggest thing, and Microsoft does a great job talking about this in their, responsible AI framework. They call it the human in the loop, but it's really human oversight. You cannot take the human out of the equation. And even with agentic AI, where there's reasoning capability, you still have to have a human look at the result. You have to say, does it make sense? There always has to be that human in the loop. That's the risk that everybody always jumps to. Though, from an internal audit perspective, the one that I always see as the biggest risk from my perspective is the lack of explainability. We are really good at about explaining why a problem is a problem. But when an AI finds a problem, it has a really hard time explaining why it's a problem. And so there's some new tools that are coming out, that help explain reasoning. Right, you can use reasoning models that show the steps that the AI went through to accomplish its goal. You can look at detailed audit logs. That's really the risk mitigation, and you can flag things, to make sure. I don't think we've really figured out how to mitigate that risk really, really well yet. That's one that's still evolving. That's one that we're going to have to work with the technology companies to really help us, remove that black box type issue. I think the third big risk as an internal auditor that I worry about is weakening our auditors' judgment. Really that over reliance on AI, that just, that makes me nervous every day as a principal. And so, we don't want people blindly trusting AI. We don't want them to forget that there's a nuance to the risks that require human judgment, right? And not fully, the AIs don't fully understand the business context or the ethics associated with a given situation. So, again, that goes back to that human in the loop solution. You need to make sure that there is a human that is reviewing the results of the AI's work, right? And a great example, we do a lot of vendor risk management, right? If a vendor gets flagged as low risk, for example, a seasoned auditor might realize, like, hey, just because you flag that vendor as low risk, I know what's going on in the market, and I've had problems with this client in the past before, and it's using bad data. We need to change that flag and make sure that this is more of a medium or high risk type vendor, because you just have that experience that's been in place for many, many years. The AI might not be able to explain it, but the human knows intuitively based on past experience, this is not a vendor that we need to just trust blindly.
Let's stay on that track of the human. Okay, so everybody's thinking about this. I know our listeners are thinking about this, and really the whole world is thinking about this with this continuation around artificial intelligence and the growth of this. What do you think about the human internal auditor role? Right, that role, is that role going to go away? Is that role going to be reduced? Will there be less internal auditors, less human internal auditors? What do you think this is going to look like in 3, 5, 10 years?
That's always the tough question, right? I think everybody's always said, will new technology replace me? Will there be something different? I think the analogy I use on this one is the internet, right? The internet came along. There were people that were out there, manning, phone lines and doing data transfers. I mean, for anybody that is an auditor, we remember that, people used to take these big tape libraries as backups, and they used to like run them out to like a storage site, right? Big physical issue. With the advent of the internet and then subsequently cloud systems, there's no longer a human being that has to run those big tape backups from one system to another any longer, right? It automatically gets backed up. That control has been changed. Similarly with AI, and then again, to your point, Warren, this is Ethan taking out his crystal ball, right? In human history, have people been replaced? Sure. But, has something better come along to help them adapt to that change? The answer is yeah, new jobs came along. There were no network engineers in 1985, right? But, today there's thousands of them or hundreds of thousands of them that help maintain the internet. For the same degree, is there an AI enabled internal auditor today? Well, to a limited degree, but is that role going to evolve into something that we've never even thought of? Probably. And I think it's going to be the AI, it's going to be the, organization like the IIA that's going to help folks kind of move into that new role. They're going to have to learn how to do something different, right? And adapt into that. Again, going back to that, we're going to have to train folks in AI fundamentals and have AI driven work. But I will say this, for the early analysis that we have done, and for folks taking, adopting these tools, what we have found is that it has actually elevated their role to be more critical thinking and more problem solving, right? It's going to be a lot less of the documenting and defining and defending of our results, and more of the how do we just move into the problem solving, which is really where we want to be anyway. It's where folks really want to spend their time. I think one thing it's also going to do, Warren, and this is going to be the most interesting piece, as a discipline, internal audit is going to have to become multidisciplinary, right? We're no longer going to be just experts in internal audit, maybe financial and IT. We're going to have to know about operations. We're going to have to know about, FDA compliance. We're going to have to know about HIPAA. So it's going to be very interesting how we're going to have to evolve into a much broader knowledge base going forward.
I probably have a little less optimism than you have in that response. Is probably the way to say it. And I'm an optimistic guy. You've worked with me for a long time. But the speed with which this technology has advanced, when you look back over, the recent past, so 50 years, 70 years of history, even 100 years of technology, the speed of this technology advancement has been extremely fast. And so the other technology advancements I felt allowed, it just took a lot longer to perfect. And so there was a lot more graduality in the transition of automation to human. And there was more time for humans to find meaningful roles and enhanced roles. My concern with this is that this is just so fast. This agentic learning is so fast. This autonomous development is so fast that the volume of work that these tools may be able to take on, I worry that the gap that it's going to leave on the human side of the roles is going to be faster coming and much larger to fill. So therefore, where does that leave some of our internal auditors? And probably the answer is somewhere in the middle of me and you. But I certainly do think that everything you said around the skills and technical capabilities of people looking to be in the profession needs to be wide and varied and has to have a very sharp eye to the advancement of all these technologies that you talked about.
That's a great point. Yeah, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but one thing to think about though, Warren, and this is one of those things that I love about internal audit, the companies that have adopted the artificial intelligence tools rapidly, they're starting to see something interesting happen with their staff. Their staff are getting placed into executive or leadership roles within their organization because what the internal auditors end up learning isn't necessarily the core of how to do internal audits. It's the core of how to run the business and how to run it well, because they have to become those multidisciplinary experts where they're like, well, how do I do demand forecasting? Going back to the retail example, the internal auditor that ended up, figuring that out ended up going into the FP&A role to help with that demand forecasting and got placed into a very high level role that normally would have taken 4 or 5 years and an MBA from a prestigious school. And suddenly they were thrust into that role right away because they figured out how to do it very quickly. So I think, there's some interesting learnings that are happening, which is now internal audit is no longer just a profession in and of itself. It's now a launching pad for, leadership, which is something that's really unique.
And I do agree with that. I do agree with that comment and that sentiment, and I am seeing that as well in the market. What is the advice that you have for internal auditors who are skeptical about AI?
Ooh. I think that that's a very simple one, and that's just go play with it. There are lots and lots of avenues to play with AI tools for free. Every single vendor that's out there that's pushing an AI tool will give you pretty much a free instance of it to work with. There's a few limited ones that won't, but the cheapest and easiest way to do it, if you have not gone out and played with GPT or Claude or Copilot or any of the relatively inexpensive tools or free tools out there, go out and play with it. See what it can do for you. Right? At a very minimum, try something different. Ask it to help you think about risks in the market relative to the organization that you're thinking about. You don't have to put any key data in there. I'm not saying go put organizational data. Don't put anything in the public models, right? We want to be sensitive to data, but start to think about how you can use these tools internally within your organization. I would say that, you noted that 48% have already started working with it. I would be willing to bet that most organizations have opened up the ability to play with an AI tool somewhere within their organization that you can take advantage of. And within that model, you should try it out and give it a shot and see what happens. There's some great things out there that will make your life easier. One of my favorite ones is a tool that we use at Grant Thornton called Flow.ai. It will automatically build a flowchart in Visio based on a transcript from a walkthrough, right? A very common thing that we as auditors do. We do a walkthrough, we build a flowchart. We want to know what the process looks like. There's a lot of tools out there that will do that automatically now, and it will make your life so much better. I don't know about you, but I don't like drawing little boxes and arrows any longer in my old day, Warren. I'm very happy to let a computer do that for me, and I can go make corrections on it. So,
No, absolutely. And your advice about go out and play with AI and get exposed to it is spot on. I've been in the profession 35 years, so people can do math. The listeners can figure out that when I went to school, I grew up in my professional life very, very differently than the way college graduates today are growing up. But I went out and played with AI and have done a number of different things in my personal life, whether it's planning a trip that used to take me, a week on and off, back and forth to do a lot of research, and loaded it into an AI engine, and within 3 minutes, spit out a 7-day itinerary, very attuned to my style, my approach. Must have searched where I like to Google and where I like to search on hotels and restaurants and other things, and certainly it gives you that aha moment when you see the speed at which this very accurate information comes back, and it just saved an immense amount of time. I've also used it to help me with slide preparation. in getting ready for speeches and preparing slides that normally would have taken a marketing department probably a week to create, and these slides are created in a matter of moments. So that's just a couple of examples where I've played around with it, to quote you, Ethan, and has given me certainly comfort and kind of that third dimensional feel on what this can do, how this can help, and when targeted and harnessed and deployed in the right way, agentic AI can certainly help drive future success for all of us. So, in closing, you have any final remarks you'd like to leave the listeners with today, Ethan?
Well, I think we kind of hit on that final remark. The one thing I will say is that, it's an opportunity to learn. The one thing I would say about AI that I find the most fun is that it is like having your own personal professor right there with you.
It is. It really is.
And so, if anything, if you need to go play with it, set a goal for what you want to learn about. I never knew that I had an interest in molecular biology or physics, especially as a career auditor myself, Warren. But it turns out that, because I have clients that work in those spaces, it's a great learning tool, and have some fun with it. Go learn something fun. It'll teach you, and it'll be like having a professor right there.
Great conversation. Thanks, Ethan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Are you concerned about security in the age of AI? Join the IIA's 2025 Analytics, Automation, and AI Virtual Conference on April 24th. You can hear from industry experts how cutting-edge technology is transforming internal audit by securing your spot and registering today at theiia.org. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch other episodes on YouTube or at theiia.org. That's THEIIA.org.